Welcome, Martyn. It's wonderful to have you here today. Thank you for making the time for these, being part of these series of interviews. And I'm just going to jump right in, if I may, at the beginning. If we go back to the beginning of your life, I understand you were not born in the southeast, but further away. Where was that? Where were you born?
I was born in 1962, Jason, in what in those days was known as a home for naughty girls in Blackburn in Lancashire. And they were known as homes for naughty girls because they were like the kinds of things you see in the films like the Magdalene sisters and others. This was where very young women who had got pregnant out of wedlock went to have their children. And my birth mother already had a child by a previous relationship. She was still, even then, barely out of her teens when she became pregnant with me. She was working as a canteen cook in an engineering works in Manchester. And she went off to Blackburn, dispatched by her parents from a sort of, I'd say, upper, lower class, curtain twitching neighbourhood. Right. Presumably on some kind of ruse that she was going away to see relatives in Ireland or Scotland or somewhere. Yeah. So went there before she was showing, and then came back several months later, in theory, with nobody any the wiser. So I was born in Blackburn, right, like the Beatles, a day in the life, 4,000 holes in Blackburn, Lancashire. Yeah.
So you grew up in the Liverpool area in the 1960s, yeah?
Yeah. My parents, as I would call them, my adoptive parents, had also married in their late teens. They were also from a very similar kind of background, and they had wanted to have children, but they couldn't, or at least they thought at the time, they couldn't have their own children, so they'd fostered from a very early age. But they were living essentially in Liverpool, and they were keen to adopt. So they put themselves down on the adoption list. I mean, in the early 60s, there were hundreds of thousands of babies like me who were born out of wedlock and who were being placed in fostering or adoption arrangements of various kinds. So my father, who was away at the time, just got a call saying, we have a baby for you. Come on Sunday afternoon and you can collect.
Wow. Gosh.
And that was it.
That was it. And how did you find out that you were adopted? Did your parents tell you from as early as you can remember, or was there an unfolding over time?
Yes. I mean, like a lot of people born and adopted at that time, the current practice then was to tell people that they were not only adopted, but they were, I quote, special or chosen. So it's really interesting that so you grow up with those labels. My mother then went on to have three successful pregnancies. In fact, she was pregnant at the point that I was adopted, but didn't know that. So my next brother down, in fact, is a natural sibling of mine, a natural sort of child of my parents. But he's only 10 months younger than me. So we have 2 months of the year where we're the same age, actually. But yes, I grew up knowing that I was adopted, never feeling that was in any way a disadvantage or in any kind of problem. But as you get older and older, you of course become curious about where you get your looks from, your instincts from. You're left with lots of quite interesting questions about nature and nurture. I don't think these things particularly, for most people, unless they've been unhappily adopted, they don't really raise their head until I think people are getting married or thinking of having children. And that's the point at which lots of sort of genetic questions come into the sort of foreground where, there's been no need to look at them since before then, really.
Yeah, gosh. It's, obviously we know developmentally how important childhood is. You mentioned nature and nurture. My parents were so abusive. One of my earliest childhood memories was that I used to wish that somebody would ring the doorbell and say, there's been a terrible mistake. The wrong family took you home. I remember at an early age thinking, I cannot possibly be related to these people. So Martyn, when you were growing up in Liverpool in the 60s, what was that like for you? What was Liverpool like in the 60s for a young boy with his adopted family?
Liverpool in the 1960s was still recovering from the war, to be honest.
Right.
And, you know, I remember going to see relatives in places as far apart as Bootle and Highton with Roby and Formby and various other places. And if you were driving through the centre of Liverpool, you were driving still, even then, through places that had been bombed or demolished and had not been in any way rebuilt at all. So it was a city that was struggling with its own depressions. It wasn't even then the sort of force on the docks that it had been. And you know, poverty was very, very apparent indeed, really. Of course, you know, Liverpool and Liverpudlians have possibly the most terrific sense of humour in the world. You know, their capacity for self-deprecation and irony is like nothing else. And for various reasons, my association with Liverpool has continued extensively through my life, largely because of academic reasons to do with the universities there and this, that, and the other. But, you know, one never fails to get into a taxi in Lime Street, and before you're even out, you know, into the one-way system, you know, they'll have made some crack about Everton or Liverpool Football Club or possibly Tranmere Rovers and some other joke about the government, and you'll be nattering away to the taxi drivers. I remember asking my grandfather once why people in Liverpool tended to speak with their teeth clenched. And move their lips, you know, you're right, pal, you're right. Which is, you know, often how it's done. And he just, without missing a beat, said, "'Cause they'll nick your fillings." I mean,
it can make a Scouser joke, Martyn.
Well, you know, I mean, so somebody said to me the other day, you know, there's been a fire at Tesco's. Asda, no, Tesco's. I mean, it's just gorgeous, really. So I'm a lifelong Everton fan. My adopted father, was a Liverpool fan. My son is a Liverpool fan. My relatives are still all up there, but they're all 6 feet under.
Great.
So they're not going anywhere.
Do you? I was speaking to an old friend the other day, my youth pastor from Luton, and my wife says to me she can tell every time I've spoken to him because I will lapse back into the local inflections and accents from where I grew up. Does that happen to you when you talk to friends from Liverpool?
Well, the curious thing for me was that I never picked up the accent. I have to put it on. And this was one of the very odd things about being adopted. My parents have the accent. My brothers have the accent. I've got 3 younger brothers. And they pick up the accents like Velcro. I mean, almost wherever they go, really. So one of my early memories was just, you know, my mother sort of putting me in a room, presumably full of aunties. They all had great Liverpool names like Winnie and Ethel and Lil and Ev and so forth. I mean, not Eve, Ev, Auntie Ev and Auntie Lil. And just told to speak because I spoke like I'm speaking to you now, a relatively deep voice for a smallish man, a boy, but not with much accent really at all. And they used to find this fascinating really, but I just genuinely don't know where that lack of capacity to pick up accents came from really.
Gosh, unusual. Very unusual. What a great anecdote. So Martyn, what were things like in your household in terms of attitudes to Christianity and faith? What were things like for you when you were younger?
I guess now, when I look back, hindsight being always a useful thing. Certainly, I'd say for the first 10 years of my life, the attitude towards church was characteristically English. That is to say that my parents would have self-identified as Christians, but we were not churchgoers, except on, Harvest Festival, Mothering Sunday, Easter, Christmas, etc., that sort of thing. So I don't really have a memory of going to church when we lived in Liverpool at all, and certainly not when we were living on the other side of the River Dee in the Wirral either. We moved south in the early 70s, the same year of decimalisation, and even then it was a couple of years before my next brother down enrolled in the church choir. And my father used to take him there, drop him off, go and buy the Sunday Express, and buy some sweets because it was Sunday, and then kind of wait for him to finish. And I was also then subsequently enrolled in the church choir, but I can't sing very well, so this was not a relationship that lasted very long.
Great.
And my father still did this. He would drive down, wait. My mother would presumably have a line or something. I have no idea. And after a while, my father started to just go in and listen. And I'd say by the time I was getting to just before I hit my teens, my parents had become involved. They'd become, I don't know that they'd become members, but their friendship network had shifted from being round table and work to being something that was more in the church orbit, really. So I was going to Sunday school by then. I remember sitting a Sunday school exam in the days when Sunday schools had exams, when I was about 8 or 9. And just doing terribly in this exam. I mean, just having absolutely no idea what these questions were about. One question was, how old was Jesus when he died? And I think I answered 12 because I knew that was a biblical number, and I knew he'd done something when he was 12, and 12 seemed a terribly old age to me when I was 8. But it wasn't the right answer, obviously. We just got gradually drawn in gradually.
Great. And did that continue? You say you got drawn in. Was involvement in the church something that continued?
It did. It was very haphazard in my early to mid-teens. I had a love-hate relationship with conformity, still do really, but I had a love-hate relationship with institutions, and they included in no particular order school, church, anything involving a uniform, and the like, really. I mean, I was, a part-time, sulky, recalcitrant, rather grumpy teenage tearaway, really. Didn't like authority, didn't like conformity. So, in other words, reasonably normal for somebody who was being hormonally challenged at that age. But there was something, I think, now I look back, about the integrity of church that kept me going. And I think it was about a consistency in kindness and goodness and opportunity, that even if you'd behaved appallingly, actually, at the youth group the previous week, they were glad to see you back. And that was genuine. I mean, it wasn't just that. And so I felt, even though I sort of grew up in a sort of, I would call it, low church environment that gradually became evangelical and then gradually became charismatic evangelical. To begin with, it was just a sort of no fuss, no frills sort of Protestant form of Anglicanism, which didn't like candles, taught you quite a lot about the Bible, and tended to try and enthuse people around that. But gave you lots of opportunities to speak to other people and to be part of that. And I found myself getting drawn in because I was valued, I was cherished. And even now, as I look back, people could probably see things in me then in terms of potential that it would take me 10 years to discover in myself. So it was an extraordinary environment, but it wasn't straightforward. I can't point you to one conversion experience that was decisive. I could point you to 10 that were kind of, an accumulation of, well, maybe this, maybe that. But there was nothing particularly about this, except when I got to the age of about 16, and I wanted to leave school. I had no interest in doing A-levels. I just really wanted to drop out, actually. And my parents made me do a sort of careers vocation test, which I hated. It's multiple choice, which I can't bear multiple choice questions. So I just went randomly through it for a day, ticking any box. My parents actually got a separate letter saying, we don't think your son's really entered into the spirit of this. And I remember thinking to myself, too right, really. Can't bear that stuff. But then they got a letter saying, your son shows promise, actually. And we can see 2 career paths for him, as a teacher and as an educator, or possibly in the church. And, of course, I've ended up pursuing both. I was furious, by the way, when that verdict came in.
Okay, I was going to ask you, did that?
I just
point you in a little bit. It had the opposite effect, did it? It was
devastated by it, because I could just about get my head around teaching in the school, because I thought I could get my own back on the institution finally. But the idea of being a figure in the church just. I looked at the vicar and the curate at the time, and I just thought, I just don't want to be anything like that, really. But it must have gone in, because within a fortnight, I realised I needed to stay at school. I resolved to do A-levels, albeit in a very, I'll negotiate my terms with A-levels and God. If you don't mind, I mean, at 16, 17, this is what you do, isn't it, really? So I chose 3 A-levels that had the minimum amount of teaching. I didn't select on any other criteria.
And what were they?
English, ancient history, and RE. It left me with 2/3 of the week untimetabled, and that's why I chose them.
Fantastic.
I also chose art A-level as well, because it was another opportunity to be unsupervised. But actually what happened was the ancient history teaching was really great. The RE teaching was terrific, and the English teaching, although sparse, was outstanding. And I realised very quickly that if I departed from what this I now recognise was a sort of vocational epiphany, if I departed from that, whatever I did with my life would be less. And so I knew probably when I was 17 or 18 that I was likely to be ordained, commissioned, whatever it would be in the church. And I knew too that I had a hunger for learning that I'd never really experienced before, up to that point.
Interesting. I'll trace with some of my questions that come up later what happened to your iconoclastic teenager, if it's still there and being nurtured. But can I ask you about your relationship with books? Because obviously to say you're widely read is an understatement, and your interest in interdisciplinary approaches and drawing from, it seems that you draw from everywhere in your work. What was your relationship like? I mean, there's a moment there of awakening about learning. So the question is, what was your relationship with books in your house? Were you aware of reading much at all? Did your family read much? Was there anything as an antecedent to this moment in your life?
No, there isn't, to be honest. I mean, my mother took me to the library and got out a few books that she thought would be suitable. But as a child, I was mostly fed on comics to keep me amused. I do remember now looking back and thinking the comic I enjoyed most was Look and Learn. And I enjoyed reading, and I probably wouldn't have known that at 9 or 10. But I can see that now. I also, when I was about probably that same sort of age, began to read my way through my parents' collection of Children's Britannica. I mean, lots of homes had these.
Yeah, yeah.
Lots of homes didn't read them, but I literally just worked my way through them because I just had a kind of hunger for that. It was kind of strange, actually. But no, we're not a bookish house at all. Nobody in my parents certainly didn't go to university. My adoptive father left school at 14. My adoptive mother at 15. None of my siblings went to university. And in fact, when I came to do tracing, when I got married to Emma, I discovered in quite a short time that neither my birth father nor my birth mother nor any of their children had been to university either. They'd all had very similar. So the bookishness, I think, grew out of, I suppose, it's not nurture, it's grown out of an intellectual kind of curiosity, which sort of took me by surprise in my early to mid-teens, and has just grown and grown and grown. So you're right. I mean, my approach to theology is magpie-like. I mean, I draw on jewels from all over the place, really, and try and weave them into what I'm doing. But I could be reading psychology, anthropology, politics, philosophy, popular fiction, and it will find its way in, really.
Do you think that's some of your iconoclastic nature there? You know how it works in disciplines, and when you're being trained, the trammels that you're supposed to stay within. Did you find yourself thinking, "Why should I? Why can't I?"
That's exactly right. Yeah, that's yeah. The why should I question is exactly right. My wife, I think she means it as a compliment, Emma. But she says the one thing you must never say to Martyn is you can't do that, because he'll ask why, and then he'll figure out if you can. Yeah. And so it's not what I'd call an ideological iconoclasm. I think it comes out of possibility, and I think it may have. I suspect it may have very deep roots in working through your adoption, and I don't mean probably like that in the way that one might want to process that psychologically or somehow in therapy or something like that. When I was teaching at Cambridge, I was given for a few years there the lovely job of being in charge of paper 3 in theology and religious studies in the university, which was the study of religion paper, which came in the second year between years 1 and 3. Yeah. And it was a kind of funny paper, really, because it had lots of hangovers from comparative religion studies in the 1960s, but was also making sort of nods into new emerging areas then. It's just nearly 30 years ago now, sociology and anthropology of religion and that kind of thing. But there was a section at the beginning which were kind of general religious questions. And you could sort of ask anything you liked, really. I mean, if you were setting the exam, which was I was doing, what's the connection between the 10 Commandments and, Christian practice of goodness and kindness, might be a question, for example. But a question I always put in one form or another was explain and explore the links between the founders of the world's great religions. So I was thinking here of Muhammad, the Buddha, Moses, and Jesus. And you could have a sort of B- if you said, well, they're all kind of quite good people and they preached kindness and taught it. Yeah. You could have a slightly better mark if you notice that they all grew up in environments that they had not been naturalized in to some extent. But the answer that I was really looking for was that every one of those children was not raised by their birth parents. They were all adoptees. Jesus technically is raised, well, in Orthodox terms, is not raised by his birth father, only his birth mother. Yeah. Moses, of course, is raised in a very interesting way. Yeah. Muhammad is raised by his uncle, and the Buddha not by his parents.
Mm.
And it seems to me that at the heart of this,
Mm.
there's a connection between nature and nurture.
Mm.
And one of the common denominators in religion is that it doesn't, when it's good religion, it doesn't work with what you might call sort of Crufts thoroughbred pedigree.
Yeah.
It gets comfortable with hybridity.
Mm.
And it's aware of and welcoming of the alien, the stranger, the otherness. That's what the hospitality of Abraham's all about. That's what Paul says Jesus is supposed to offer the church. You know, we're adopted by God to be children of God, because and the church is to be an adopting agency, an adopting community.
Mm.
Why? Well, because you know, we were first adopted by God.
Mm.
And so there's a practice here about bringing alterity and otherness into the equation.
Mm.
Now, that's got to be done, of course, responsibly, but I think for me, deep down, there is, I think, a psychological trigger, which is against rejection. For whatever reason, it's for incorporation and adoption. And it's unafraid of that, because the heart and the mind should both be big enough to manage it. Which is not to say it does not need managing. It does need managing. So I think long before I could understand myself, those seeds were probably planted in the very way that I was nurtured. You know, a son yet not a son, fully ours and yet other. And on it goes, really.
So, Martyn, I'm a little bit later. I'll ask you about illustrative fragments. One of the other things that you talk about, going from the particular to the general. Again, it's just been fascinating. I know you and your reading, but you know, to discover what some of those, as I said, those antecedents are, and that you think might have formed you and you react against, and that you are. I'm discovering in my 50s a sort of permissiveness around what I want to do in my own research and thinking. So Tolstoy's idea of the hedgehog and the fox. You know, are you a hedgehog who goes deep into one thing as a specialist, or are you as a fox that runs around? But realizing there's such a thing as a neo-generalist, and I think that's what I've always starting to discover about you. You know, you'll be superficial where you need to be, but you'll be deep where you want to be as well. This, you know, the word transgressive is in all of your research, but there's this wonderful picture of a transgressive teenager making his way through the world as he shapes his life. My relationship with books was interesting, in that my family all come from working class mining background and didn't read. I don't remember my parents reading at all. But when I was 12, after having the confidence knocked out of me by my parents physically, managed to persuade the local town library to give me a reader's pass for the adult library. I don't know how I had the gumption to do that. And I would go down every Saturday, stroll around every section of the library and pick up a book on anything. First time I took them all home and opened the door, my mother said, "Who the bleep do you think you are?" Such was her animosity. And I do remember as a 12-year-old thinking, I'm not like you. And I think you're helping me realize there was something that kicked in at a very deep level to me, that to establish who I was meant I would pursue this. And I'm hearing something similar with you. Thank you for unpacking that with your childhood.
I think you know, transgressive is a good word here, and I think that there must have been something going on in my childhood and yours, which just allowed us just enough power and permission to do a little bit of assertion, so that you could go to the library and you could, you know, get out this, that, and the other. I mean, one of the things I really enjoyed about doing my doctorate was sort of getting lost in libraries, really. And I remember, you know, Cambridge University Library, and just, you know, finding a whole sort of corridor of books on power, the study of power, the philosophy of power, power relations. So, you know, Weber and Stephen Luke's and Stuart Clegg. I mean, these people have nothing to do with theology. But you read this stuff and you think, goodness, I can now see a shape here in what I'm trying to describe. I'm going to use that as a reference point to describe polity. I mean, I had at the time a very gifted but slightly kind of po-faced supervisor. Yeah. But he was terribly encouraging about this. He would just say, well, I mean, he was also a why not man. And actually, where he got his why not from was being raised in a Quaker boarding school. And of course, it's kind of cosmic Christ. It's, the world there's everything in the world has been created for a purpose. Why don't you discover what that purpose is before you start, as it were, trying to divide the wheat from the tares and the sheep from the goats? So he rather encouraged, I would say, if anything, over-encouraged my capacity, my fondness for reading widely. Yeah. And it took another supervisor to say, stop, you need to write something here. Stop reading all of this stuff and just kind of, get on with it, really. But yeah.
Brilliant. So Marty, just a little bit, so go back a couple of steps and then we'll move forward again. So then you moved to Hertfordshire.
Yeah.
To go for high school. Was that a culture shock for you? The move from the Liverpool area down to Hertfordshire? Do you remember? Was it a happy time for you?
It was. It was a time of odd adjustment. I vividly recall struggling with the first 2, probably 3 years of that transition, and really not enjoying school at all. Constantly coming bottom of the class. I mean, I wasn't doing well, and I think that was to do with lots of things that were going on at the time around me. My parents, I think, then took me out of that school and put me into an incredibly odd, quirky school, which now no longer functions. And I have to say, had it not gone bust, I think safeguarding would have closed it down anyway. It was really odd. And I can still remember the music teacher, who was one of, I think, 1 in 250,000 people can part their hair using only their scalp muscle. This is something that probably won't impact on you, Jason, but
I just did imagine it, and I can't unsee it now. So
you can't. And so he would do this in a music class, and he would get a boy on each knee and bang out his tunes on the piano, and much to our delight, of course, would flick his hair without moving his head. Revelation, really. But there were all sorts of strange things. But what I do remember about the school is, for the first time, finding that I was enjoying learning. And even though I wasn't especially well behaved at the school, I was figuring out, probably by the time I was, I think, 12, that there were things about learning that were really quite stimulating and enjoyable.
Brilliant. So, I mean, we've already covered, you went off to your awakening for learning and go off to university. What did you study at university, Martyn? What did you read?
Well, I read theology, and again, as you might expect in the family that I came from, although my parents were by then, card-carrying Christian church members, nobody had been to university in my family. And so the question was, well, why are you going to read theology? To which my answer was, well, because it's the subject that I've enjoyed most at A-level, and it's what I want to do. Yeah. And so there were quite a lot of difficult conversations about whether this was a useful subject, whether it would lead anywhere. Yeah. My father could sort of get his head around law, because that would lead to a career, but theology appeared to lead nowhere in particular. And of course, if you were going to be ordained, as I might have been even then at the age of 18, thinking about that, then there was no point in doing this. But I stuck to my guns, because I think I realized that if you're going to do anything at university, it's got to be something that is going to be a consuming passion. And I couldn't see any point in learning anything for any other reason. So I went to Bristol for no other reason that I had a friend in the church youth group that had gone there, and he said he enjoyed it. But I mean, I simply, this is 1981.
Yeah.
I didn't know how many universities there were and what they did.
Yeah.
I didn't know very much about anything, really.
Yeah.
I didn't apply for Oxford or Cambridge because the school I was in made you stay on for a 7th term to do that, and I couldn't think of anything to do with the other 2 terms. So I just sort of went to Bristol, got my grades, and off I went, really. And loved it, really. I mean, it was an extraordinary experience on a number of levels. Firstly, I think expanding the field of theology for me through doctrine and church history and biblical study, beginning to look at religious studies. Like a lot of undergraduates, I varied my church practice enormously, which ranged from nothing to going to Roman Catholic folk mass in the morning and a house church in the evening, to joining something that was evangelical, mildly charismatic. And, I mean...
I'm laughing, the magpie at play.
The magpie at play, but...
18.
Yeah, the magpie at play is there. But also it's that sort of consumerist sort of buffet approach to religion. So, going along to the Christian Union, doing things for the Christian Union, but not really enjoying it because, frankly, it was incredibly boring. But realizing it was somehow important. I mean, you're learning interesting lessons at that stage of your life, that actually not everything that's worth doing and has to be done is necessarily interesting.
So you mentioned earlier of having multiple conversion experiences. What was there anything before you went to university in terms of a significant experience of faith that you took with you as you went off to university, Martyn?
I think it was that moment in my mid-teens when I'd done the careers vocation test, and I think had figured out that I was no longer following something for myself. I was still a bit sticky on this because I'd also figured out that my love affair with books, radio, and the media was quite deep. So I'd sort of resolved to get myself a kind of mini career, if I could, or ideally not a mini career, a career in some form of communication. So I dipped my toes into advertising, marketing. Even when I was a student, I was doing a little bit of copywriting for publishers and advertisers, and doing a little bit of radio work for what was then BBC Bristol and GWR radio. So I knew that I enjoyed communicating. I don't think I was very good at it at that age, but I knew that I quite enjoyed working with words and preaching and thinking through things. I was very blessed, really, to have in the church I'd come from a number of people who worked for the BBC, and they worked in areas of leadership, production, development, script writing, and so forth. And I just remember lots and lots of conversations with some of those. They were really good people who would say, well, if you want to do something in radio, or publishing, or writing, these are the sorts of things you need to be thinking about. So even in my late teens, I'm buying books about writing, and I'm buying books about crafting things. And then in my second year at university, I wrote a sort of pretty cheeky letter to a publisher. I said, I'm interested in getting into publishing when I graduate. Do you have a graduate publishing, do you have a sort of graduate internship scheme that is open to people like me? I'm interested in theology and academic books and so forth. And they wrote back and said, no, we don't have a scheme like that, but why don't you come and have lunch with us for a day, and we'll have a natter. So I went. I thought it would just be an hour and a sandwich. Turned out to be about 5 hours of conversation. And at the end of the day, they said, right, well, we've not had a graduate trainee before, but if you're interested, we will take you. So it was the most strange day, because I sort of walked out of a conversation that I had no control over, and they sent me a letter about a week later saying, you know, here's your letter saying you can start work on this date. And they were great. They put me through just about every area of publishing at the time that you could: sales, marketing, editing, copywriting, advertising, sweeping the floor in the warehouse, boxing up books, you know, sales conventions, print ordering. So it gave me a very rich insight into how it all worked, really.
So when you were pursuing that, Martyn, what happened to this sense of one day becoming ordained? Had that receded into the background, or was it still moving along with you through that time?
I don't think it receded. I think I was keeping the lid on it. I was pushing it down as much as I could. I was enjoying my publishing, and I was enjoying the challenges of that. I was, as one does sometimes, doing my own bargaining with God, saying, well, I think I'll carry on with this for another 10 years, if you don't mind. And then I'll have a think about ordination, maybe when I'm in my 30s. It just didn't work like that. And there was a season, I think it was probably around about 1987, when I'd been working for one particular publisher. And I was just ending up in lots of conversations with people saying to me, have you ever thought about being ordained? And the first time you get that conversation, you say, oh yes, and you explore it. But by the time you've had it for the 10th time in 3 weeks, you have made a sort of private vow to yourself and to God, saying, the next person that asks me that question, I'm going to deck. And sure enough, within 6 hours, somebody just looks at you and says, have you ever thought about being ordained? So I thought, I'm just going to give up here. I didn't actually know what to do at this point. I went to see my vicar. My vicar put me in touch with a director of ordinands who saw me almost immediately, saw me again, and then said, okay, well, I think we'll just send you off to a selection conference and see how it goes, really. And depending on your point of view, it went either very well or very badly. But anyway, they wrote to me and eventually and said, come.
Yeah. Was their lack of enthusiasm for your entry disappointing after all those signposts from everybody else in your life who saw your inner priest?
It was a real mixture. Validating and affirming, and so in some ways deeply comforting. In other ways, I think I had psychologically prepared for a bargain. Maybe I don't have to do this full time. Maybe I can carry on doing what I enjoy and perhaps go and train part-time and be a part-time non-stipendiary priest later. I mean, I had it kind of all worked out, really. And I'm always fond of that Woody Allen aphorism, how do you make God laugh? Will you tell God your future plans? I mean, I had lots of future plans. I was going to move from marketing in books into mainstream advertising. I wasn't necessarily, I was going to have my cake and eat it. I might still get ordained. I might still do a PhD. But actually, what was interesting about 1987 to 8 for me was the way in which this all came crashing in. And I thought, gosh, this is serious. I think I'm being called, and I'm not in a position to dictate terms for that. This is very much about how do I hear the call, and am I prepared to respond? And in the end, this becomes the heart of what religion is, isn't it? I mean, religion is, in a word, surrender. It's being prepared to say yes when you don't actually quite know what the question was. It's therefore a terrifying step of faith. And yet, on another level, how else would you live your life? Once you know the question's been asked. You could say no, but that would be less of a life. That would just not be what we were created and redeemed to be. And so these things go right to the core of who you are as a human being. And And it doesn't mean that you're competent or good or kind, but you do know that you've been had. I mean, had in a good way here. You know, you've
I know what you mean.
not you've been conned, but
I've got my own moment. If we confer together, I can remember I got my theology degree, ended up working as an independent financial advisor in the City of London, and suddenly it turned into a career that I wasn't expecting. And then there was the opportunity, the company were growing, to be limited, become a partner, and there was suddenly this whole way of life. And given my background, it was quite tempting to. It was financial security, leadership in the church, and I remember going for a walk, and it's one of those moments where, you know, the Holy Spirit guides your imagination, and I could just see all the way through to the end of my life, very clearly on that path.
Yeah.
And then when I thought about what I had my own calling to ministry, I couldn't see it. But it was almost like, you know, the cliche, the road less traveled. And I thought, I don't want to get to the end of my life and then see what that path could have been. And I remember similar, for me, for my surrender was I've got to find out what this is. I can see where that one goes. Yeah. And it's quite terrifying.
Yes, because in a sense you are surrendering. You're giving up control, and you can negotiate over the details, but actually you did sign the contract. But you weren't shown, in a sense, what the rest of it would look like. And we, I think, have all kinds of fantasies and fondnesses about how our ministries and lives will pan out. And I think, you know, God just chuckles, really.
Yeah. Our plans for ministry success don't stop until God impinges the realities of the world on us.
That's
so,
right.
Martyn, can I ask a little bit? I understand from some writings online that you witnessed a tragic road accident. Was that around this time?
Yes,
was that part of?
Yeah. So I was with a colleague. We were. He was the sales rep. In those days, this was all done by driving around. We were going to bookshops, and I was watching him pitch, and I was trying to get a sense of what would help this in terms of copywriting for point of sale material and so forth. We were up in Scotland, and I think the only way to say this is I had a kind of weird premonition that it was a bad day. It was quite early in the morning, and couldn't really figure this out, but there was nothing to indicate that it was a bad day. It was a perfectly sunny day. To cut a long story short, I was driving, my colleague was on my left, and I could see this cyclist looming out of the central reservation of a dual carriageway. And there's that, it's in slow motion in your head, but in fact we're dealing with split seconds here. There's that moment where you think, well, surely he can see me coming, and then you realize to your horror he's just going to cycle into the path of your car. I remember jamming on the brakes, and we just hit him. I mean, the skid marks were, I can't remember the numbers now, but the police came to measure them and said, you know, you were doing 60. That's what those skid marks say. And I said, yeah, I wasn't speeding. You breathalyze, I don't drink, but, you know, all of that really. But it was I must have been appalling for his family. He was an older man living at home with his parents. I believe an only child. I don't know much else about the circumstances. But the car swept him up. He came through the windscreen on my side, crushing my hands against the broken windscreen. I still have glass in my knuckles to this day. And then, of course, when the car stops, he's then deposited several, if not dozens of yards in front of you. And then you stop, rush out, and try and do what you can, but there was nothing to be done other than try and stem the bleeding, really. Other cars stopped, and I had to go to hospital. It was a sort of local hospital, and then I realised that he hadn't survived. My colleague was unhurt. I think for me it did lots of things. It was a shock. It was a trauma. It was a struggle to drive after that. It was a struggle to sleep. You kept waking up in the middle of the night with flashbacks, lots of what-if moments and that sort of thing. For me also, it was an interesting, sharp turn in my theology, because I was in a church where, I mean, this wasn't what the church was preaching, I hasten to add, but some people in the church would say, we can heal your memory. And we can drive out the whatever they deemed this would be. And it seemed to me that this was all about them and not about the man who died, and not really about me. This was about their, what I would call, theological, spiritual construction of reality being imposed on reality in a way that was completely nonsensical. And then you're only kind of, aren't you, sort of an inch away from thinking, well, actually, this person clearly couldn't be healed, with those traumatic injuries. People in war situations can't be healed. People who were blown up and apart can't be healed. So what are all these people doing talking about healing at this time, when actually they're quite well off, really, and they're pretty healthy, and all of the healings are largely unverifiable and internal, heart murmurs and unspecified cancers, when in fact people who are traumatically injured have to wear those wounds, or they die by them. And anyway, most people's diseases in this world are caused by poverty. They're caused. So it sort of set me on I think probably a theological road to some kind of realism, to begin questioning what I was being exposed to. Psychologically, it also left me with another uncomfortable epiphany, which was because I'd done no tracing at that time of my genetic parents. Have I come near to somebody to whom I'm related? Would I ever know? So it was a profoundly disturbing experience on lots of levels. So yes, I mean it's and the better people in the church were the ones who engaged with the trauma, and in a sense honoured the woundedness, rather than seeking to either deny it or annihilate it. So actually, no, this in the end, if you can work with this, it actually makes you a better person. It'll do things with your empathy and your compassion. They weren't saying it's a gift or it's divinely ordained. They're just saying, this stuff happens, and how you deal with it is going to really determine quite a lot about the kind of ministry, possibly about the theology that you develop.
Yeah. So Martyn, you mentioned, so did you trace your parents at this point, your biological parents?
No.
You didn't?
No, I had to wait to meet Emma to do that, and it was the shock of really meeting Emma, and realising almost immediately upon meeting her that we were powerfully attracted to each other. We went out for a walk to clear the air after knowing each other a little bit I think we'd known each other 4 weeks. We came back from the walk having realised that we were in love and decided to get married. So we kind of got engaged even before we'd had a date, really. But my experience of meeting Emma's father and mother was who were not together, was to see that there were strong signals of nurture running through them that were in Emma. And suddenly to realise now that actually I wasn't carrying any of those with my family. So we waited and waited, didn't do very much, got married, got ordained, managed to finish the PhD, had our first child, Ben, 1993. It was probably the experience of having Ben, I think, that really began to accelerate that agenda. And I remember when Ben was just a wee baby, really, we all went out for dinner with my folks, really. And actually, I think my parents raised the question. They said, you know, have you ever wanted to trace? And I think it was quite a genuine answer on my part. I said, well, I don't know, really. Not really. You know, I mean, one set of parents is enough, really. I don't need another set, really. I said, I guess I'm curious. I know I can trace if I want to. And they were just very generous. They said, well, you can, if you want to do that, you do it with our blessing. You know, don't be, you know, they were very undefended about it, actually, which was really not what I'd expected. I'd expected them to kind of freak out, but they didn't. They were very undefended about it. And I just very sort of casually said to them both, well, I guess I've always wondered who I look like. And they both looked at me and they said, oh, you look like your mother. And I said, what? They said, oh yeah, you're the spitting image. So I said, well, how do you know that? And they said, oh, well, when we adopted you, she insisted, against the rules, again, theme, on a personal handover. But we weren't allowed to use any real names. So we were Mr. and Mrs. Smith or Jones or something, and you know, she was Miss Smith or Miss Jones. And my mother then said, she said, you know, you were handed over in girls' clothes. I think you've got a sister. And I think I remembered the address on the milk tokens, and then just read this address out. Well, when it came to tracing, of course, my mother had remembered the address correctly. There was a half sister. So my birth mother hadn't bothered to go out and buy anything new from Mother Care. She had just kitted me out in stuff that my half sister no longer fitted. And my birth mother didn't want to meet. And I think when I embarked on the journey, I respected that. I think I thought, well, you know, I knew enough about adoption by then to know that for some people, re-entering their lives 25, 30 years later is going to be a trauma. And they gave up their children on terms and conditions. You'll never see the child again. Don't worry, go and have a nice life. The child will have a very happy life. It'll be a better life than you can give it. I mean, those are things that are deeply comforting to people when they're in their late teens and early 20s. And I imagine that they help people to live their life in reasonable security. So I knew that I wasn't going to break that. So my birth mother just wrote through a mediator saying, don't contact. My half siblings on her side were rather more keen to find out about me, and my birth mother had gone on to have another child out of wedlock who'd also been given up for adoption, and then another child out of wedlock, and then she'd married the father. So she had 4 children, all with different fathers, and she had kept 1 and 4 and given away 2 and 3, but then she'd left 1 and 4 and gone off with somebody else. So it was quite a sort of broken situation, really. My birth father, however, when he got the letter from social services, wasted no time in getting in contact. He knew when my birthday was. He'd made some financial contribution to postnatal care for my mother. He was married at the time that I was conceived to somebody else, obviously. That marriage was still intact at the time. So we had a very sort of circumspect relationship while his first wife was alive. But then she died towards the end of the 1990s. And then we saw a bit more of each other. And then it was only really when I came to Christchurch and he visited me casually one day with some friends, you know, as you do. And I sort of took him aside and I said, Robert, it's very nice to see you. And what have you said to your friends, though, about this trip? And he said, oh, nothing really. I said, okay, it's fine, it's okay. And it's your life really. I said, I'm not going to say anything, but if I were your friends, I'd be quite curious about why you're having tea with the Dean of Christ Church. I said, it's just not kind of, it's a bit odd really. And he said, do you think so? I said, yes, I do actually. Because I think I'd be asking, how do you know me, and so forth. And I think, so anyway, I sent them off on a tour with one of the tour guides, and he came back a couple of hours later. He said, oh, I've told my new partner, and she'd guessed.
Oh, great.
So I then met his two sons,
Yeah.
who are of course also half siblings as well, and we see a little bit of each other as well.
Oh, well, thank you for telling me a little of that, Martyn.
Yeah,
really.
I mean, none of them are religious either, and none of them university. So,
Yeah.
My life to them is like sort of something between, I don't know,
Yeah.
Alice in Wonderland and Harry Potter, really.
Yeah.
With the Vicar of Dibley thrown in. Yeah.
Yeah. It's I have my father was bigamously married while he worked abroad, and I have 4 half brothers who are Filipino. And my wife still takes great delight when friends find this out over the years and say, what do they look like? And then she says, a Filipino version of Jason, which no one can quite, until they see a pic, what would that look like?
Yes.
But it's amazing, isn't it? We look for correspondence, don't we? And looking at someone else, to get a sense of who we are and where we're from, however different that might be.
Absolutely right. And I mean, the curious thing for me in adoption was that, as some people sometimes do, they find the relatives in Ireland and they go over there and they have great crack. And actually, it is like finding long lost family. For me, it was like finding more of my adoptive relatives. I mean, they were just still different to me. So it's kind of
more authority. Yeah, brilliant.
Yeah.
So, given that you were this non-conformist teenager, it sounds like you never dabbled with the thought of becoming a Baptist minister, or, was it, I didn't hear you once consider any other trajectory into some sort of ministry other than the Anglican Church. Is that the case?
Nearly. So I had this season in my life, I think a good 2 years, where I was going to a house church in Bristol during term time, and actually run by somebody who had been an Anglican chaplain and vicar and curate, and then had opted out in the days of sort of restorationism, and in fact now has gone back into the Anglican Church. I mean, but that was the only thing that really I thought might be possible. But I don't think I knew enough about it and couldn't figure out what it was. So I could see on one level myself doing that kind of leadership, but I could also see that it was incredibly haphazard and personal and individually driven. So as I was coming towards the end of my time there, some teachings in the congregation had started to disturb me. They seemed to me to be quite abusive, and there were people in the congregation who'd raised questions about this teaching, and they'd been sort of absolutely slapped down for even questioning this. So there were kind of 2 levels of abuse now: the teaching that they were getting, and then the abuse they were getting for questioning the abuse. And there seemed to be no accountability in this, no structures, and people were easily out narrated. They would protest, but of course they would protest, wouldn't they? Because they had a demon of doubt, and they were unhealed, and they weren't what they thought they were, and so on and so on. So I remember going off to see a very wise university chaplain, and we started talking about this actually, but he very quickly flipped the conversation into what did I think I would be if I was a minister. And I remember him sitting me down and saying, well, how do you imagine this? I mean, when you think of yourself, what are you wearing? I thought, gosh, what a strange question. And I had to answer. I said, well, I sort of do see myself wearing robes. I don't really know why, because I haven't got any. He said, do you see yourself behind an altar or in a pulpit or, you know, on a stage or... And I said, like, do you know, I actually see myself behind an altar. But, you know, my practice in communion was like kind of, you know, piecemeal, to be blunt. So it was getting in touch with that vision, that sort of visual imagination, which was forward-looking, because nobody had asked me those questions before. And did I see myself like this house church leader? And I had to think in the end very hard and thought, no, I don't, actually. I'm not sure I like or trust what I see. Even though I remained very fond of this individual, and I think the teaching that was going on at the time was strange and very aberrant. And I think that the house church community recovered from that and, you know, had a very decent innings before it eventually imploded. But at the time, it was, you know, where's the permission to ask the question? Where's the permission to dissent? So I think I'm what I'd call a loyal dissenter. I you know, belong to a dissenting tradition within a tradition that's conformist. Doesn't make me a non-conformist. Makes me deeply suspicious of people who do conform without questions, though.
Yeah. Gosh, that's fascinating. Helps us chart your trajectory, Martyn. And in a moment, ask you about power in your PhD. I can see where all these themes developed and emerged. I used to be very envious of my friends who left London School of Theology as Baptist ministers. You know, there was a training route, there were resources, and my, as it was then, version of the charismatic house church movement was very resource-less. I had to be bivocational and establish everything myself. So I used to envy my friends with that level of support. But over the years, I've watched, and I guess you have too, watched many friends burn out of ministry.
Yeah.
With the power that took place in congregational settings. So families, you know, those dynastic families in a church that wield the real power in a church. So it's always about power, isn't it, somewhere? So let me ask you about your PhD. So words, wonder and power. Very close to home for me because it was a study on my family tribe. I remember I've read your book 2 or 3 times over the years, and I remember the first time thinking, is this my family? And then the second time probably thought, this is my family. So you in the main theme of the book, as I understand it, was about power, wasn't it? Were you using, even at that point, so why the Vineyard Church? And was it an illustrative fragment for you of the wider issue of power in the whole church or just the charismatic church?
Yeah, I mean, like a lot of people who do doctorates in the humanities, I sort of fell into the subject and it enveloped me. It's a little bit like being sort of slowly eaten by the nectar at the bottom of a Venus flytrap, really, isn't it? It's just kind of, you know, it just kind of gets you and you can't get out, really. So I was recommended for ordination in early 1988, and I was told I could do an MA PhD, as I had a degree in theology already. I'd sort of half had a go about 4 years earlier, when I thought I might want to study the Church of England during the First World War. And I'd made a start on that, but I kind of figured out that although I found the area very interesting, I couldn't progress it really particularly. So I just sort of left it, really. So here you are, you're in your mid-20s, somebody says, the Church of England's expense, you can do a higher degree, what are you going to do? So I sort of cooked up a proposal, which I think was all about C.S. Lewis, as I remember it. And I put that in, I was approved. I thought, great, that's lovely. But I remember going to have lunch with Andrew Walker, who wrote Restoring the Kingdom. Probably only about 3 weeks before I went to theological college. And he asked me about this, and he just sort of said to me, well, why are you doing that? So I sort of said, well, it seems reasonable, really. Everybody reads C.S. Lewis, etc., etc. Oh, he said it's going to be really boring. You're going to end up doing lots of work on romanticism and English literature. You don't want to do that. What are you interested in? And I just sort of sat there and I thought, well, right, what I'm interested in is marketing, language, the way it persuades people to do things. I'm very interested in claims about church growth, which even in the mid-80s, I was beginning to think were not what they looked or purported to be. The church I was part of by then had been partially Wimberized. So we did have people who were going off to Anaheim and other places and coming back, very fizzed up actually. And there were lots of good things about that. I mean, things I thought were excellent, but also lots of strange things about it that I couldn't quite process. And we had St Andrew's Chorleywood very nearby us, so that as it were was pretty well fully drinking at that trough really, and in again a way that looked extremely constructive for them, but left you with lots of questions about casualties. I mean, I just became aware in my own youth group, which I was sort of running, at weekends, that we were starting to see a number of people who had perfectly ordinary things that teenagers and adults deal with, and they were being problematized in a way that was making those problems even worse, because they were being given a spiritual account and often a demonic or cosmic account of what was going on, which seemed to me to be well beyond unhelpful. It was becoming abusive actually, and real difficulties were not being dealt with. So my critical antennae were certainly switched on by then. And the consequence of this was I just, probably in about a day, wrote a proposal which was about the church growth movement. It was about Donald McGavran, and then, but with a tip into the sort of new wave of church growth, which said church growth is not theory, it's not really about marketing, it's not about fundamentals, it's about experience. That was Wimber's great kind of line. How do you grow the church? Well, by the replication of paradigm-shattering power encounters. If people see the miraculous, they will come. And his whole way of reading the Book of Acts was largely based on that trigger. So that's what I started to do, really, and it took me into what we would now call ethnography. I would go to conferences, I'd make notes. Don't really think I did anything that was a formal interview. I certainly had no ethical clearance for doing what I was doing. Nobody bothered to ask for that. I went off to much stranger healing missions that really were over the line in terms of abusive, partly again because I wanted to get my bearings for what I thought was acceptable, unacceptable. I did, by the way, then, as I do now. I mean, I think Wimber was largely on the acceptable line. I think there were, again, a bit like my house church experience, there were occasional forays into things that you just thought it's a bad mistake. But you only have to go through your wardrobe over 25 years to realise that we all make mistakes. We all bought bell bottoms when we thought they were in, and they were completely hopeless. So that was that, and I think then I became very interested in the language of power, which soaked its way through Wimber's discourse and his writings: power healing, power evangelism, power encounters. It was a screamingly obvious thing to write about. The question is, how do you write about power? So I read my Weber, my Durkheim. I only discovered Rana very late. But by then I was reading Marxist theorists of power like Stuart Clegg, Stephen Luke's, and others, and thinking, gosh, this is how it works. It works in a reciprocal way. It works to magnify. It works to separate. It works purposefully. It requires reification. So it was moving in those sorts of circles and I had just this wonderful, for about 3 years, this doctoral supervisor who just encouraged me to read very widely. Had no issues with me going off to read a Marxist philosopher on how power works, which never would have occurred to me. But having accidentally discovered the work of Stuart Clegg, it kind of gave me the most realistic map of what was going on, I felt, in these churches.
So, Martyn, it seems that, I mean, you already had it, but from your PhD work, your interest in the lived practices of the church sort of continues unabated. It's one of the things I think of most when I think of you and your work. You're always, the word maps, you're always trying to map things for us and find different ways to map them. Is that the case? Am I right there?
Yes, very much so, because I think I'm always fond of that interesting little vignette that Rowan Williams gives us in his book on Christian theology, which was written about 20 years ago now, where he's giving a lecture, I think, in Germany to some graduate students, and at the end it's kind of any questions, and somebody sticks their hand up and says, well, Professor Williams, this is all very well, very interesting, thank you, but we don't really get your methodological starting point, or in fact we don't really understand your method, actually. So can you sort of say something really that we'll understand? And Rowan quite kind of clears his throat and says, well, of course, strictly speaking, all theology begins in the middle of things, which is largely true. The creeds don't start with somebody sitting down in 150 AD thinking, what we need here, guys? Creeds. Nobody sits down and says, I know what, we need a Bible. These things grow up and they are organic, and they begin in the middle of chaos and disorder and order and so forth. So I think congregations are very like that. Lived Christianity is like that. Life is like that, actually. Most of the decisions we make are in the middle of things. Very few things are decided and determined by prescriptive ideological decisions that take no account of what we are facing. And that's true in pastoral ministry. It's true in almost everything that we do. So for me, I think the business about beginning in the middle of things was the realization that even when I was doing the early stages of the doctorate, I was getting in touch with my sort of early anthropological pulses, that there were stories and incidents, critical incidents, which were very telling. And the fact that only outsiders noticed them as being strange was in itself telling. And that when the group told you what was telling, you were onto something, because they would say, well, look at this. And you would say, I can see that, that's interesting. But why didn't you point me to that? Well, that's not interesting. And so, well, you may be right, but maybe it is. And I got very struck by what I'd call the grammar of assent, to shamelessly riff from Newman. But the grammar of assent in these charismatic evangelical churches, much as it is in any church actually, is laid out by the assumed nature of the worship and the language that it uses and the aesthetics around that. So for, middle of the road, should we say high aesthetic Anglicanism, which will be choral matins, choral Eucharist, robes, very ordered. It's fundamentally an aesthetic but mild experience. If you come out of matins supercharged with excitement, it's either been the most amazing matins or something's gone very badly wrong, it seems to me. I mean, you were talking about maps. I mean, I sometimes refer to this as a matter of climatology. I mean, if you go to a Pentecostal church and it's not
Yes.
at least a warm experience,
Yeah.
and ideally a hot, if not sweaty experience,
Yeah.
it's not been a good day at the Pentecostal church.
Yeah.
If you go to a Scottish Presbyterian church and anything gets close to room temperature, people start to get shifty, and because it's basically supposed to be cool towards cold. And you can characterize at least English Anglicanism as having an ideal inner spiritual weather, something that they think reflects the mood of God, sunny intervals, the odd cloud, the odd shower, much like the weather today, sunny intervals, the outlook mild. Anglicans love mildness. Just, gentle Jesus, meek and kind. I mean, these are the sentiments of the church. Now, the sentiments, I think, drive the theology. And if they don't drive the theology, they're so utterly compacted within it that you can't have a theology that's not sentimentally driven. So conservative evangelicals, certainly in Anglicanism, it's a lot about Christian manliness. Paul's a decent, manly kind of Christian man. Jesus is a Christian man. They're good at their preaching and their teaching. It's pretty hearty. It's very didactic. It's very public school. People who step out of line get punished because they deserve their punishment. And, it's not surprising that doctrines of substitutionary atonement become penal in these equations. There's a real compact between class, race, schooling, sentiments. What do conservative evangelicals not like about charismatic renewal? Emotions. Can't stand them. Don't want to be anywhere near emotions because they suspect that they're just sort of liberal Trojan horses. If people start talking about how they feel, they might say they feel anything, they might go and do anything. So conservative evangelicals just, they regard elements of charismatic renewal as an absolute anathema. I mean, me as a sort of fairly mild, sort of middle of the road Anglican, with some left-wing leanings and that kind of thing. I think charismatic renewal's onto something. I think, feeding the feelings is an important part of religion. And it may not be the food I choose, but it's an important food. And there are no bad foods. There are only bad diets.
Yeah. I remember hearing Tom Smale not long before he died, presentation made to him at King's, and he was talking about the charismatic church and people mistaking him for a charismatic, and he said, no, I can't even do an impersonation of his broad Scottish accent. He said, the charismatic, it's like your auntie, it's a lovely place to visit, but I wouldn't want to be there. It was fantastic. So Martyn, reasonable radical, you had that experience of a group of people getting you together and talking about you and taking your work apart and then responding to it. And I love how Ian Markham, who I know you've collaborated with for a long time, he highlights in that book something I've mentioned at the beginning of the interview here, the idea of the illustrative fragment, going from the particular to the general, and as being key to your work. And it gets me thinking, that's what we do with everyday life, don't we? If I want to show you something about my wife, Martyn, I won't take you on a tour of 50 fragments. I'll probably pull out one thing, one memento, one memory. So my question for you is was this an observation that emerged through your PhD work and studying the lived life of the church, that you saw people would, like you were saying, people would say what they were interested in, this one thing was illustrative? And were there any academic streams and methods that were validating what you were looking at, or did you have to pioneer that all yourself?
I think now, with the benefit of hindsight, I can't say that I pioneered it, but I wasn't aware of it when I was doing it. So I was largely busking, really. And I think there's a lot to be said for theology as authentic busking. It's not quite that we make it up as we go along. We are knocking out some things that are required and resonate. But in this case, I think for me, if I was doing my doctorate again all over again now, I would be very deliberately referencing it in the anthropology of local cultures, aspects of congregational studies, which is actually going to be to some extent very similar. Tapping into people's worldviews and their language and so forth. I'd be doing more work on rhetoric, and I would be using terms like ethnography, none of which appear in the doctorate at all. What I'm doing is going around picking up magpie-like, Velcro-like little vignettes and illustrations. I think, what I would say to students now is you've got to be careful of this, because it could be quite eclectic. It clearly could be abused. So you've got to have something in place that makes this honest and authentic. And also, therefore, almost by definition, it's got to be offered in a spirit of humility. So if you say to me, look, well, my wife's like this, and here's a couple of stories to tell you, she might appear behind you in 5 minutes and say, well, those are 2 stories that's just what you think I am. I will tell these stories. So in fact, you've got to tune in quite deeply into these communities and individuals. And I think you've got to do some real work to be sure that they own the vignette. This is a narrative that they concede as being a fair reflection of them. Now, when you've got that, I think you can then say, okay, well, that's interesting, but there are other ways of reading this. And can you also see that actually, if that's the only kind of thing that nourishes you, there might be a theological or ecclesial or psychological or pastoral trajectory here that could be opportunistic, but could be problematic. So stories of instantaneous miraculous cures, I don't think they need to be proved or disproved. What one needs to work out is, what are they doing for people who have stubborn conditions and pathologies that aren't dealt with instantaneously? How do you handle and manage their guilt? What does that say about them and their relationship to God? What does it say about their view of God? Are they not good enough? Are they not doing it well enough? And of course, we've all experienced ministries where people are told the reason they haven't got their healing is because they weren't good enough, or they weren't faithful enough, or they didn't pray in the right way, or they didn't pray well enough. And we know what these things do, and thankfully there are not many of those kind of things around anymore. Although they do seem to come back a little bit like viruses, just when you think we'll never see it again, it comes up like a rash, doesn't it?
Cancer cells that haven't fully abated. So Martyn, I've worked you hard, asked you lots of questions, and we're almost at the end here. And in a way, we've done things the other way around. Normally, a focus is on the most recent things, and two large roles for you being the principal of Ripon College, and now the 45th Dean of Christ Church. So if I can have the audacity to reduce them to a few moments at the end here to an illustrative fragment, and say, from your time at Ripon and then the move to Christ Church, is there a fragment you can share that's illustrative of what those times have meant for you, being at Ripon and then coming to Christ Church?
Yeah, I think for me, it was a great joy and privilege to be asked to be Principal of Cuddesdon. I realised that the thick connection you get with people at that point when they're trying to learn about theology and learn about ministry is extraordinary, actually. I do remember, here's my illustrative fragment, being interviewed for a little college newspaper that popped up sort of halfway through my time there, and the question from the seminarian student, the ordinand, was very perceptive. What do you think you're trying to do here? It's a totally disarming question. Well, I mean, there are dull answers. I'm trying to keep the thing solvent and going, and I'm trying to get more student numbers to do that, and make sure the conference trade works well and keep costs low. I mean, that's boring stuff. That's obvious. And so, what she was asking me was, "What do you think you're trying to do here?" And there was a silence, and I said, I think I'm trying to help people who've come here who are already very good to become even more good. And my reason for that, I said that seems like banal, pathetic actually on one level, is because I don't mind if I send out ministers who are not top grade preachers, not top grade administrators. They might be a bit clumsy liturgically. These things won't, in the end, matter very much to their parishioners and their communities. But good clergy matter. And by good, I mean good in the Platonic sense. Good people, kind, generous, hopeful, truthful. And I said, I think my reason for this is it's got to do with the way in which ministry is now being re-narrated all the time as being an endless sort of acquisition of tools and toolkits and tasks. And I said, I think it really goes down to something really simple. It's the prologue of John's Gospel. Christ, God becomes one of us in order that we might become one with God. And so there is that sense in which God chooses to occupy a space in the world. Palestine, 2,000 years ago, marginalized, poor, oppressed, occupied country, and chooses to occupy that place, and then becomes preoccupied and utterly occupied with the marginalized and the broken and the desolate. And in that notion of occupation, that's where our calling is. We don't have a profession, we don't have a job. We are just actually supposed to be occupied with God as we can possibly be, as occupied with the cares and concerns of God, which is God's people and God's creation, as we can possibly be, and to be as occupied as we possibly can with what God wants us to do and be in this world. So we have an occupation. And of course, the thing with occupations is they're all-consuming. There's no end to it. And that's what a vocation is. And I see my time at Christ Church as being, in some senses, very similar. It's about understanding the nature of an occupation, but knowing that there are tasks and jobs and roles to be done on top of that. But in the end, it's about being as filled up with God as you can possibly be, because that's good for you and good for others. And when you are, you get filled up with the other people, because actually God is anyway.
Well, Martyn, what a wonderful place for us to finish up. Thank you for answering so many questions for about an hour and 3/4 here, and for being vulnerable and open, and thank you for your work and your research, and wish you well with everything that you're attending to.
Thank you, Jason.
Thank you, Martyn.
It's really good to be with you. Thank you.
Bye. We hope you enjoyed that, and we have many other interviews with amazing guests where we listen attentively and respectfully to discover people's backstories through their beliefs and life experiences, and find out what shaped them into who they are and inspires what they do. You can catch all those interviews by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. You can find audio versions in your podcast platform of choice: Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, SoundCloud, Stitcher, etc. Just search Extra ECC. Of course, you can go to extraecc.com and sign up for our newsletter and find all our social media links and more. And by the way, all links are in our show notes below.